Morning, everyone. Sorry to be late. I got caught in some things. Here we are. Okay, so we're going to continue today with this essay by Marvin Spiegelman on what did I do here? Let's see. I gotta get this back on my screen. Sorry, I need it here. Okay. I have the YouTube up so I can see your chats this morning. And sorry to be a little fingered this morning. But I am ecstatic because we have cast our ballots. So come what may, our votes are cast today. We are in Maryland, in Annapolis, the state of Maryland, which happens to have voting regulations that allow us to vote very early, earlier than most of my friends, I guess. So anyway, I'm pleased that we've got our votes in and counted. Okay, so we are in this essay, and the last sentence that we read was perhaps the achievement of God within is still not strong enough to withstand an addition. Um, Now, that's a pretty strong statement. And what it means is that we have to actually get to the point where all of us can experience God within ourselves. Um, it's a recognition by Jung, which we talk about frequently, which is that God does exist, but God exists in the psyche, in the unconscious. God does not exist in the physical world, which we can look out into, going back nearly to the Big Bang, and we can look down to the smallest Higgs boson, I guess, and we don't find God in the physical world. We only find God within ourselves. So this is what Marvin Spiegelman was talking about last week. And so if you've missed that session, I urge you to go back and take a look at that. Um, so I will go on. I'm on page 170 of this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And here's what he says. Jung respectfully met and overcame a succession of Jung respectfully met and overcame a succession of hugely powerful figures, from Elijah and Salome to Melonius, the Christian anchorite, a devil, Isdabar, and others, even the ultimately leading figure, Philemon, without taking the heroic stance of intending victory. The fact that he ultimately achieved inward focus and wholeness is a model for us all and is truly amazing. Finally, advising us to do what he did, take up your own inward challenge, is even more inspiring. I surely followed his example, but arrived at my own psycho-ecumenical myth, as evidenced in both the Tree trilogy and in my books on the relation of Jungian psychology to the monotheisms of Buddhism and Hinduism and of spiritual paths, I shall describe the further development of that myth later on, but I need to preface that by several other significant events. Um, okay, so Marvin Spiegelman is writing, in effect, here a memoir about how he got to the point where he could write a trilogy of books entitled The Tree. So you can refer back to that. The first of those took place when I was suffering my difficulty in finding a publisher for my first book, The Tree. One morning, despairing and wondering if I was truly following the self in this psychoecumenical work, I took my bicycle, as I often did, up to Mulholland, a hill road between Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. Soon I saw a man whom I had not seen since high school, walking his dog. He had become a famous psychologist after treating a world-renowned singer, publishing a book about his method. I got off my bike, of course, and greeted him. He then told me about his troubles, a publisher who did not treat him right, a difficult marriage, and an expensive holiday home in Europe. I got the point and rode off on my bike with a diminution of any envy I might have had, and grateful for this synchronicity. Riding on for a few miles, I then encountered, to my amazement, a large stag standing in the middle of the road. One sometimes saw deer in this area in those days, but never a stag, and certainly not on the road. The stag and I looked at each other for what seemed like a long time. He held his head high, with antlers that impressed me deeply. I even imagined I saw a crown on his head. I bowed, and it seemed that he did too. He slowly turned and walked back into the hills. This deeper encounter with the alchemical self both calmed and reassured me. The dignity of this creature, living on the fringe of civilization, who was both connected and apart, manifested his own truth. Amen as example. With less astonishment than recognition, I was glad to find a publisher later. This very meaningful synchronicity and resolution did not end the matter, however. I also had great difficulty with this publisher and felt the need to write about that too. I had been reading the works of H. Rider Haggard again, as I had done in my adolescence, and had been delighted to learn that C.G. Jung also found this writer of she to be one who had encountered the anima, another author. Henry Miller was a friend of mine who readily offered to write a blurb for me after he read The Tree with appreciation. I therefore titled my book Rider Haggard, Henry Miller, and I, the Unpublished Writer. This was, of course, a story about my troubles in publishing, plus an anima adventure with the deceased and celebrated author. This book was published more easily later on with a more reliable publisher who brought out many of my books subsequently. In the meantime, a colleague and I, interested in magic, as that spiritual discipline was called, discovered that the foremost living practitioner of that art, Francis Israel Rigardi, was living in my own backyard, so to speak, in Studio City. When we went to him seeking instruction, he told us that the energies activated in that work, were formidable, and thus it would be wise to undertake Reichian therapy as an accompaniment. My colleague and I were both aware that our Jungian therapy did not fully include the literal body, and such investigation and experience could be helpful in any case. I agreed to such an undertaking. Thus was this was in 1971, and I was 45 years old. Uh, Good morning. I'm going to keep reading for a bit. Um, Rigardi had undergone both Freudian and Jungian therapy in England, as well as qualifying as a Reichian practitioner. He had also He had also, of course, been an assistant, as was well known to the infamous magical personality, Aleister Crowley. Rigardi stuck to performing all the body work that Wilhelm Reich and his followers had devised to break down the armor, as he called it, of body resistance and memorial pain. This was substantial indeed, and I once again felt called upon to write a book about my first 4 years of an 8-year treatment under that discipline. My Jungian colleagues all understand when I characterize this phase of the work as negredo and a merciless confrontation with the shadow, much like what Jung did in that part of the Red Book called Scrutinies. True to form, I wrote a book about those 4 years, this time titled Jung, Reich, Rigarde, and Me, the Unhealed Healer. As in Scrutinies, the archetype of the judge was relentless in demolishing any pretension or defense of the miserable ego, thus accomplishing what Jung did there and in his slaying of the archetypal hero earlier on. The main positive consequence of that treatment was that my experience of the whole of the subtle body, as noted in Alchemy and Jung's work, took on full substantiality with the literal experience of that energy in a tingling in the hands, sometimes feet, and full body, an awakening of the Kundalini chakras. This became manifest in my analytic practice with patients as a signal of the activation of the self in the work. It was also shown in my resumption of my psycho-ecumenical myth in writing again sometime later. Two other events intervened, however. First of these took place in the 1970s on the occasion of the visit of Marie-Louise von France to the Pan-Aryan Conference arranged by our local Jungian Society. I was still apart from that group, but wanted to see my old teacher. She had been my control analyst in Zurich. I wrote to her and asked for a meeting. She graciously invited me to dine with her at her hotel, paid for by my society. And just before meeting her, I had two powerful dreams. In the first dream, I was on a bridge in a medieval European city, headed toward a golden city in the distance to the east. Coming toward me was a crippled fellow on a kind of skateboard. His lower extremities hung lifelessly as he greeted me. I returned the greeting, and he announced that he was God. Strangely agreeing to this, I bowed to him and invited him to a glass of wine at a kiosk on the side of the bridge, for which he thanked me. Then, before my eyes, he took on full bodily form, healthy and very tall. We then toasted each other, after which he held out his hands to me, and from them flowed into my own palms silver and gold coins from every country and time. I awakened from this dream understandably exhilarated, noting that the self had now embodied and that my psycho-ecumenical myth was further affirmed. Good morning, Shri. Good morning, State of Awakening. I'm reading the end of this essay about the impact of Jung in his Red Book, A Personal Story by Marvin Spiegelman. And so lots of things come to mind. Obviously, Jung did not have the same experiences I had, but I can relate to this as well. And Spiegelman obviously had different ones from Jung. So reading on. And if you have any questions or comments, please do put them out on YouTube. That same night, I dreamed again, this time in a less personal way, but still of the self. In the dream, I was told that God was a great worm. His body was the universe itself, galaxies comprising his organs, and he was closed in on himself in Euroboric fashion. He was engaged in a great rhythmic breathing. I was also informed that many creatures, including me, were to be found in multiple points in that universe, and that at these points one could have mystical experiences. I concluded that the second dream was revelatory of the Godhead, and the very and the very and the first presented my personal self, something I later confirmed with the Red Book. When I told these dreams to von Franz, she nodded solemnly and said that with the worm, I must have suffered greatly, which was certainly true, and I appreciated the confirmation. She also supported my separation from this society, and we enjoyed a lovely evening. Honoring the dream, I supplied the wine. The second event was my founding of a psycho-ecumenical group in the outer world. I had often led teaching groups, of course, but this one mirrored my initial dream of the divine child being born in the company of a Jewish rabbi, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist priest. The present group consisted of clergy who were also therapists, all of whom had been analysands of mine earlier on. They were an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, a Japanese Buddhist priest, a Roman Catholic priest, two Catholic nuns, an Episcopalian priest, a Protestant minister, plus occasional guests from other religious backgrounds. That group met monthly for 20 years, and I was delighted to hear from them that they often felt freer together than they did with their fellow clerics. One can certainly imagine that. when if you have a group of clerics getting together, one must not maybe would feel reticent about talking about doctrine in a group of other clerics. And certainly a lot of what Jung taught us is heretical in many religions, of course. And why is it heretical? It's heretical because it challenges the tenets of many religions, and that's an assault on the collection plate. And so all clerics have to keep the mystery somehow, and they do it by the traditional means normally in order to keep the funds flowing into their religion. And that's why it's going to be a fairly long time, maybe even 600 years, that Jung said, before we see them admitting that there's something else that other than their doctrine. So reading on, please feel free to comment as I go. Around that same time, I realized that my two last books on the unpublished writer and unhealed healer were actually continuations of my inner ecumenical bent. And I then changed my ongoing journal writing into volumes chronicling the dream sharing and texts exploring of similar inner figures now residing at the various chakras. At the first center, Muladhara, dwelt the unfrocked, self-imposed Catholic priest. At the second dwelt a Japanese Buddhist woman, the empty teacher. The third chakra carried the Muslim powerless magician, while the fourth, the heart chakra, supported the unhealed healer, a traditional Jewish man. At the fifth throat center was the unpublished writer, a Hellenistic Jew, along with his pagan muse, Lady Tewfik of Tewfik land. With Lady Tewfik, the failures ended, and the third eye was the home of the Protestant Jungian scholar, the Baroness. And at the top, the carryover from the very first book was the Hindu Maya, the Yogini. The title of the book, understandably, was Failures and Successes. When Henry Miller learned of this project, he was delighted, saying that he did his best to work when he felt like a failure. All my psychoecumenicals were largely inner, with some connection to the outer world, with the exception of healer and writer, with whom I identified outwardly as well. Along with teacher, then, I was engaged in lecturing. I am now in the 11th volume of that unpublished series, and they will linger in the archive that has been established in my name at the University of California, Los Angeles. Okay, so he's writing here. So going on. That brings me to the present, March 2017. And so that's the time when this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, was envisioned by Thomas Arst and Mary Stein, and these essays were solicited. Reading on. That brings me to the present, March 2017, close to the birthday of my beloved wife, Rima, who died last June, age 84, after 63 years of marriage. This last event is decisive and brings my work closer to Jung as well, in unexpected ways. The first few months after her passing, I was totally devastated, grieving and mourning and weeping and sobbing, and even calling out her name, more like a Middle Easterner than the native Californian that I thought I was. The grief and tears seemed endless, aided only by sharing with my daughter, Tamar, and by my listening to my favorite Mozart piano concertos. Gradually, though, I noticed that love was making its powerful entrance in the tears. I felt opened up and wept at the appearance of love in spouses, lovers, family, nature, and even love of country. At Christmas time, I found myself weeping on witnessing the face of a young woman as she received a beautiful jewel from her beloved in the advertisement of all things. At first, in an advertisement of all things, at first I thought this was from knowing that my wife had been At first I thought this was from knowing that my wife had been a skilled silversmith. Maiden name was Silberstein, and that in my dream the night before we wed, I had presented her with a large uncut diamond embedded in a stone. That self-image was indeed refined by her and by our love over the years, but now the love was manifest in tears, more alone, both alone and with patience, when the self was constellated. Now too I realize that God was and is in the tears, as shown in Sufism, wherein our longing for God is the same as his longing for us and is revealed in those tears through emptiness and fullness. Furthermore, I recalled that such tears are out of the gates of heaven in Jewish mysticism, and once opened, cannot be closed. So, like Jung and von Franz, I find that after a life in search of meaning, I discover that God is in the love, and that we are, as the Hindus say, two peas in a pod, just as are my beloved wife and I, as revealed in this recent dream. I am floating on the great sea with my wife, sensing that I am going to die and feeling happy as long as I am with her. A stone, Rock of Ages, Philosopher's Stone, then rises up from the depths, just big enough to hold us both. Realizing that this is temporary, we hold each other contentedly. Before long, a boat appears and helpfully brings us to a nearby island. The island seems to be a beach resort for families who have suffered tragedy or disruption, or, on the other hand, have had unusual closeness and harmony. This is told by an older man who says that this is a Jerusalem redivivus. Okay, this is a Jerusalem redivivus and constitutes one of many such places in the afterlife reality wherein people are healed, rewarded, or challenged to grow. Such heavens and hells are multiple and are temporary in that spaceless and timeless condition. Upon awakening, I see how people in near-death experience claim to have been with Jesus or in the happy hunting ground of Native Americans, but I wonder how such multiple souls and conditions can be accommodated. I then hear the wise man say that this is what is meant by the infinite power and love of the Godhead. Psychic reality is the key. And Jung thought so, too, as revealed in the Red Book and in Memory Stream's reflections. He may not have the deification envisioned in our colleague Edward Edinger as carrying the name of the age of Aquarius, but he is certainly a great harbinger of that age, showing us how to relate to the divine within. Although not for everyone, of course, his example 100 years later seems to me to be the best one available for many on the spiritual path. Thank you, Herr Professor Dr. Jung, for this gift that has been a lifetime guide in my search for meaning. And thanks to my wife, Rima, who has shown me the path of love. Together, the two comprise my outer guides in the inner path of the self, who has been present from the beginning. The author passed away on September 22nd, 2017. This is the last work he authored. Okay, so a number of things come to mind as I read this. I'll go to the simplest one first. And that is as it relates to death and loss of a loved one. I find and have found over a long period of time now that when a loved one dies, that's only in the physical world. And actually nothing changes in your psyche with respect to that person. Obviously, nothing can change in terms of what they are doing in life because their life has ended. But I've found that my love, if anything, has been quite deepened after their death. And specifically, I refer to the loss of my brother in 1988 at the age of 39. We'll celebrate his, I think, 77th birthday, no, 76th birthday on October 26th. And even though he died at age 39 because of polluted water in the Colorado River, he uh, still is with me in my heart. And I find the same is true with my parents. And and so that's one thing that comes to mind here. And the other thing is something that happened to me this morning. I happened to be listening to Paul Simon's concert in the park, which he did in 1991. Many of you may know of the Simon and Garfunkel concert in the park, which was in 1982, I believe, or 81, which I also saw live, but it happened that I was living in Tokyo at the time, and they brought the same concert to Tokyo. And I was quite, and at the end, many of the Japanese were lighting their cigarette lighters and waving them back and forth as as a homage to Simon and Garfunkel. Uh, but this morning, I was listening to Paul Simon's 1991 concert in the park, which attracted about 750,000 people. And I happened to be listening to his solo rendition of Bridge Over Troubled Water. And I didn't realize how much that, first of all, that song, but also, and that song has always been very meaningful to me, and I'm sure to many of you. But I was really impressed by uh, something that seemed to be coming out of the collective unconscious, because when he started to sing um, Bridge Over Troubled Water, 750,000 people also sang along. And as you see, I'm getting quite weepy about it because it was very moving to listen to that, even though it was 33 years ago. And to hear this recording of this huge group of people um, who don't know one another, all, maybe not all were singing, but a lot of people in that crowd of 750,000 people were singing along with Paul. And it just is a statement about the collective unconscious, it seems to me. And and so anyway, So enjoyed that rendition. I was listening to it as I was working on my painting this morning. And are there any other comments about Marvin Spiegelman's um, memoir here before I go on? I'll go on to another essay since this has ended much more quickly than I expected. I don't have Jordan with me to also comment, so I'll be happy to take your comments on YouTube. Um, and Therese says, to our world, most definitely, Skip. And Richard says, Bridge is very moving. It makes me think of Jesus. And I'm glad that it does. So does Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues. Okay. Well, obviously, songs touch us deeply, whatever they may be. And I guess I know the song Nights of White Satin, although I haven't focused on it as much. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel have been part of my life since I was 19 years old, I think. I first saw them in a concert at my college in our chapel um, when I was 19. And I've since seen them at Korakuen Stadium in Tokyo. I've seen them in concert at the Convention Center in Washington, D.C. I've seen Paul perform um, solo at Wolf Trap, um, and I've I've seen him on another number of other occasions in one way or another, perhaps on video or something. And he, in the same sense that people who are fans of country western music talk about how country western singers, you tell my life. Well, he obviously touched me very deeply um, in when I was 19 years old. I don't remember what year it was, 60, it must have been like 65. Um, and and his music has ever since. And I've listened to a lot of it over the years. So listening to his rendition what has always been very moving to me, even when I listen to it as I'm painting. Uh, so anyway, um, so the next essay in this book and um, the book I'm reading from is Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst. Um, this ultimately became a 5-volume set, um, and with about 70 essays on the work of Jung, looked at from different perspectives to give everyone a chance to look um, at Jung in different ways, in different personal ways. Now, on the first page of this essay, I'm just going to show it to you. There's a photograph of Bollingen, and that house is the same one that's behind me in this image. Um, and this is this is the one in the essay is a photograph that this author of the next essay took himself, and it's Encountering the Spirit of the Depths and the Divine Child by Andreas Schweitzer. uh, Introduction: The Poorhouse in the Beyond. Carl Gustav Jung once called the tower the house that he built for himself on the lakefront of the upper Lake Zurich at Bollingen, a confession of faith in stone. Accordingly, we might say that the tower is the material equivalent of the Red Book, which I would call a confession of faith in an imaginary and symbolic form. C.G. Jung recounted repetitive dreams in which he saw a rather poor house located on the opposite side of the lake from Bollingen, on the upper part of Lake Zurich. The house is the beyond, was not the house in the beyond was not actually on the lakefront, but rather situated on a plateau in the midst of pastureland and luxuriant vegetation. Even though Jung knew that this house must have something to do with his personality, number two, that is, with the eternal or whole man, this could never really satisfy him. He also always had doubts and a bad conscience that he had neglected that house or even completely forgotten it. In short, the house was a bit characterless. Jung knew that his dreams, that the key to the, from his dreams, that the key to this house was in the hands of an old countrywoman. Though Jung described the inside of the house quite precisely, it nevertheless remained somehow poor because he had to spare it, as he put it, which probably meant that he had not enough time to be alone and prepare for the house in the beyond. And this is very interesting because for me, when I was young in my 13th and 14th year, I lived I lived in the summertime with my grandparents near a beautiful Finger Lake in upstate New York, specifically Cazenovia Lake, which if you looked at the lakes of the Finger Lakes, Canandaigua, Seneca, Cayuga, and so on, Cazenovia Lake would be the sixth lake side by side. And these were lakes that were carved out by glaciers millions of years ago. And so our family farm happened to be just above this Cazenovia Lake. And in that town, there are two unique houses. One is called Lincoln House, which was the home of the patron uh, for this area and for the farms that were given by the Dutch West India Company. And one was the home of Frederick Remington, which I often saw in my travels around there. Frederick Remington, of course, being the maker of the Remington rifles, which we might all chagrin his work, but nonetheless, his house was quite beautiful, and it was white up on a hill, and it was sort of a desiderata for this 13 or 14-year-old, as I used to sail on the lake and I used to see these two homes. And Lincoln House, which is at the end of the lake, is now a museum. And I'm not sure whether anybody owns the Remington House. I suppose they must. But anyway, it's not significant. What is significant is that I have had this experience also. And, you know, in my older years, I look at those places and say, well, you know, they're not really where I would want to live. But when I was a kid, it was really those places were really a desiderata. And so I just mention that as I go on to read this text. Okay, so for many years, Jung had no clear idea of what that unfinished house really meant. Then one day, it was almost like enlightenment. He suddenly recognized, of course, that's it. It clicks. The Red Book also had never been finished. He immediately realized that what he had recorded in his Red Book must now be shaped into another form. In the present form, he said, it sounds like prophecy, and this I really detest, for there is not the whole human being in it. That is not the whole human being in it. There is not the whole human being in it, quote unquote. After this insight, Jung became aware that he had not yet found the right language and that he still had to translate the text of the Red Book into something more concrete. I saw that so much fantasy needed firm ground underfoot, and that I must first return wholly to reality. And for him, this reality meant, more than anything else, scientific comprehension. Only an increase of consciousness, that is, the higher level of consciousness, can serve as the firm ground underfoot that brings fantasies into reality, into human reality. And I certainly see in myself that change, because as I was a 13 and 14-year-old boy sailing on Cazenovia Lake, um, it seemed like it was the center of the world to me at that time. And of course, I knew that the world was much larger because I had lived on the Mojave Desert. I had lived in Kodiak, Alaska, and Paw Paw, Michigan. And now I was spending my summers with my grandparents and enjoying the use of the lake very much during that time. Um, but at that time, I saw those two houses as very large and symbolic of something hugely important. But now, in the context of my life experience, which has been very broad and has encircled the world more than 75 times, believe it or not, um, and has had me living overseas about 10 years of my life, uh, I, I see the world that we live in is much larger than me in my world, which I had as a child, right? So, um, and so I had to find my own wholeness. Um, so here's Jung's quote again: "There is not the whole human being in it." After this insight, Jung became aware that he had not yet found the right language and that he still had to translate the text of the Red Book into something more concrete. I saw that so much fantasy needed firm ground underfoot, and that I must first return wholly to reality. And for him, that reality meant, more than anything else, scientific comprehension. Only an increase of consciousness, that is, the higher level of consciousness, can serve as the firm ground underfoot that brings fantasies into reality, into human reality. We are quite fortunate that Jung struggled for decades to elaborate on the raw material as presented in the Red Book in order to bring it into a less archetypal or prophetic language. It was his creative demon who forced him to formulate and reformulate the messages of the inner world in order to make it comprehensible to his contemporaries and for future generations. This was hard work indeed, which at times brought him to the edge of exhaustion and even of death. Until his old age, Jung was in the grip of that demon that overpowered him again and again, forcing him to continue with his writing. A creative person, he stated in his memories, has little power over his own life. He is not free. He is held captive and driven by his daemon. This transformation of the images of the unconscious into the language of analytical psychology was a tremendous creative task that can hardly be overestimated. When I now read Jung's work, it may happen that I recall this or that passage of the Red Book. Aha, I say to myself, that is where Jung's surprising idea stems from. It is as if we could now see the original unconscious images that lie behind the psychological expression, or to put it in another way, as if the theoretical or scientific way of expressing something became more alive through the image of the Red Book. However, this is also true as seen from the opposite side. The more familiar we are with Jung's collected works, the better we can understand the imagery and symbolism of Liber Novus. They mutually penetrate each other. So let me just look at your comments here. Cherise says, Walden's Pond was meaningful for me, walking with my son, and I concur with that. I went there once by myself and walked around the pond. And Richard says, strange how alchemy always involves stone structures from pyramids to cathedrals. Absolutely. And hello, Penelope, good to see you. And good morning, Kathy. Okay, the next part of this essay is entitled From Fantasy to Ethical Obligation. One might argue that being in the grip of a creative demon holds Jung for Jung's life since he was a genius. But as I am far from a genius, I can hardly imagine that there is something like a creative demon in my life. After all, I am not Jung, Picasso, Kandinsky, Shakespeare, or Rilke. This attitude, I believe, is a tricky self-delusion, a cheap excuse to avoid the responsibility and burden of one's own individual nature and destiny. So the question would be, how can we deal with our own psychic raw material? I believe we are all happy when we have a moving or numinous dream, but the dream image as such is not yet, is not yet the whole matter. The whole includes the understanding and the realization of the inner images in actual life, or as Jung put it in his memoirs, insight into them, namely the images of the unconscious, must be converted into an ethical obligation. Not to do so is to fall prey to the power principle. In his Tavistock lectures, given in London in 1935, Jung beautifully described the ethical obligation or transformation work as the jewel of wholeness. I assume that it was in retrospect to his experience in the Red Book that he said, quote, the descent into the depths will bring healing. It is the way of the total being, of the treasure that suffering mankind is forever seeking, which is hidden in the place guarded by terrible danger. This is the place of primordial unconsciousness, and at the same time the place of healing and redemption, because it contains the jewel of wholeness. It is the cave where the dragon of chaos lives, and it is also the indestructible city, the magic circle or temenos, the sacred precinct, where all the split off parts of the personality are united. unquote. Wholeness requires accepting this dragon of chaos. In his Red Book, as well as in the Tower of Bollingen, Jung created substantial vessels, both of which served him as a temenos for his entire scientific life's work. Okay. Okay, the next section of this essay uh, is called The Spirit of This Time and the Spirit of the Depths, like Liber Primus. A painful standstill. In the first section of the Red Book, titled Liber Primus, we find the chapter heading Refinding the Soul. Here, Jung described his overpowering vision of the flood covering all of the land between the North Sea and the Alps, which finally turned to blood. Quote, when I had the vision of the flood in October of the year 1913, it happened at a time that was significant for me as a man. At that time, in the 40th or 39th year of my life, I had achieved everything that I had wished for myself. I had achieved honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness. Then my desire for the increase of these trappings ceased. The desire ebbed from me, and horror, Groen, came over me. The vision of the flood seized me, and I felt the spirit of the depths, but I did not understand him. Unquote. Quote, horror came over me, unquote. This is the way the spirit of the depths often, if not always, announces itself in someone's life. Today, we would not call it horror anymore, but rather a traumatic experience. I am not a specialist in trauma theory, but I have the impression that these theories often miss the archetypal truth or message of trauma. The horrific experience of a trauma can transmute, if at least partially understood and accepted, into the realization of the spirit of the depths, that is, into the first and often most terrifying experience of the dark side of God and of the Deus absconditus, in other words, the missing God. From then on, the demon is weakened, the demon that actually forces people to express their inborn creativity throughout their entire lives. I believe that many analysts have had such an experience of horror at least once in their lifetime. It is an initial experience that compels someone to follow the path of the soul. That is what happened to Jung with his childhood dream of the subterranean phallus. The text of the Red Book continues. Yet he, the spirit of the depths, drove me on with unbearable inner longing, and I said, quote, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? Should I tell you everything I have seen, experienced, and drunk in? Or do you not want to hear about all the noise of life and of the world? But one thing you must know, the one thing I have learned is that one must live this life. This life is the way, the long sought after way in the unfathomable, which we call divine. There is no other way. All other ways are false paths. I found the right way. It led me to you, my soul. Unquote. When Jung wrote this text, he was in his 40s. He had achieved practically everything a man can wish for himself. He had his family with healthy children. His practice flourished. He was at the crest of his fame. More and more Americans and people from over the world came to see him. With the money of his wife, he had built a huge and beautiful house for his growing family at the Lake of Zurich, etc. But still, as he felt it, something was missing. This feeling didn't change until that vision broke into his life and forced him to understand the spirit of the depths. However brilliant the success, no human fortune or happiness could remove this almost unbearable inner longing, the longing for his soul. Excuse me, sorry, I couldn't get to my mute fast enough for that. All right. And that has caused me to lose my place. Okay, so something was missing. I'm just going to resume that page. This feeling didn't change until that vision broke into his life and forced him to understand the spirit of the depths. However brilliant the success, no human fortune or happiness could remove this almost unbearable longing, the longing for his soul. My soul, where are you? It was a question of survival for him. He knew that he must find his soul. Much later, when he recalled that time of his life while sharing his thoughts with Aniela Jaffe, he suggested titling the chapter of the autobiography referred to in the Red Book, quote, "Lucky to have escaped death," unquote. As we know, this title did not appear in the book. One thing became clear to him. If you couldn't find the courage to descend to the spirit of the depths, and if you couldn't find access to the spirit of the depths, as opposed to the spirit of this time, he would not survive, for life would lose all meaning. At this time, Jung was the professor of the University of Zurich, but he decided to resign his chair. He realized that scientific work in the regulated setting of academic teaching at the university would always hinder him from connecting himself with the spirit of the depths and with his soul. To talk about the soul is by far the same as having a vivid relationship with the soul. We should never forget this. As analysts, in our business and seeming self-importance, we are always in danger of talking too much about the soul while neglecting the care for our inner life. Hopefully, a depression of some or some other so-called neurotic suffering will prevent us from this, so that we might be willing to turn back to our soul. Quite self-critically, Jung confessed at the beginning of the Red Book, quote, I then still labored misguidedly under the spirit of this time and thought different about the human soul. I thought and spoke much of the soul. I knew many learned words for her. I had judged her and turned her into a scientific object. I did not consider that my soul cannot be the object of my judgment and knowledge. Much more are my judgment and knowledge the objects of my soul. Therefore, the spirit of the depths forced me to speak to my soul, to call upon her as a living and self-existing being. I had to become aware that I had lost my soul, unquote. Jung gradually lost his passion for scientific discourse on the soul. His journey to the inner world, or to be more precise, to the spirit of the depths, took away from him his belief in science, for only he whose desire turns away from outer things reaches the place of the soul. Obviously, science was not able to express the living soul, to express her often childlike vitality. Thus, he came to the conclusion that scholarliness belongs to the spirit of this time. but this spirit in no way grasps the dream, since the soul is everywhere that scholarly knowledge is not. Um, the spirit of the depths forced Jung to talk directly to his soul and to enter an intimate dialogue with her. The Red Book is a most impressive document of a Western man searching for the lost soul, struggling with her, and thus entering the increasingly deep encounter with her. The search for the spirit of the depths is the predominant topic of Liber Primus, which is titled, quote, The Way of What Is to Come. In the first sentences, we already hear of this theme, quote, I've learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, there is still another spirit at work, namely that which rules the depths of everything contemporary. The spirit of this time would like to hear of use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way, but I did not consider the spirit of the depths from time immemorial, and for all the future possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time, that who changes with the generations. He is the spirit of the depths. He, the spirit of the depths, took away my belief in science. He robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things, and he let devotion to the ideals of this time die out in me. He forced me down to the last and simplest things, unquote. Quote, he forced me down to the last and simplest things, unquote. This reminds me of Jung's dreams of the poor, almost shabby house on the other side of the lake. There was a countrywoman who had the key to this house. The spirit of the depths, or as we might also say, his soul, forced him down to the last and simplest things of nature. Therefore, it's of no surprise that she, the farmer's wife, knows about the spirit of the depths, unquote. Toward the end of the Red Book, expressing somehow the goal or quietessence of the whole book, the same spirit of nature is addressed in a very moving way. First, we read, when the God enters my life, I return to my poverty for the sake of the God. I accept the burden of poverty. And not much later, quote, I return to my small garden that presently blooms and whose extent I can measure. It shall be well tended. The future shall be left to those of the future. I return to the small and the real, for this is the great way, the way of what is to come. I return to my simple, realistic reality, to my undeniable and most minuscule being, unquote. Quote, I return to my small garden that presently blooms, unquote, is an allusion and clear antithesis of the Faustian hubris that deeply concerned Jung throughout his entire life. Although the big tower in Bollingen, along with the kitchen on the ground floor and the two small dormitories on the first floor, is a small tower that Jung added 8 years later in 1935. This is the so-called chapel, Jung's place of meditation. Above the entrance door of this chapel, chiseled into the arch, we read, Philomonus sacrum Fausti penitentia, the sacred place of Philemon, the atonement of Faust. So whenever Jung entered the chapel to meditate, he was reminded of Faust's sin. But what is his sin? Even though I am aware that the beautiful story of Philemon and Baucis even though I am aware that the beautiful story of Philemon and Baucis is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, is well known. Some stories are so true that they bear repeating again and again. So I offer it here once more. Quote, Jupiter and Mercury, Zeus and Hermes, decided to come down to Earth, wandering around disguised as peasants. Whenever they knocked and begged for shelter, they were haughtily turned away. Finally, when they came to the miserable hut of the old couple, Philemon and Baucis, they found an open door. The old couple welcomed them and served them a meal. When they wanted to slaughter their only goose for their guests, the goose sought shelter in the lap of one of the visitors and thus was spared from being slaughtered. It was only much later when Philemon and Baucis saw that the wine jar was refilled magically that they recognized their divine visitors. The gods rewarded them by granting them a wish, and the two asked to stay together until death and even afterward. Thus, when they died, the humble cottage was changed into a magnificent temple where the two served as priest and priestess, unquote. So again, what is Faust's sin, and what is the sin of modern man? At the end of Faust 2, Faust, in order to increase his properties, carries out his megalomaniac plans with great ambition and with an inflated consciousness. In the midst of these properties, however, there was still the small place, including the garden and the chapel of Philemon and Baucis. Faust was annoyed at the sound of the church bells of these pious people. Thus he gave an order to Mephistopheles to get rid of them, whereupon Mephistopheles immediately killed the old couple, which was not exactly Faust's conscious intention. In the epilogue of Psychology and Alchemy, Jung dealt with the Faustian hubris. He said, with a side glance to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, quote, in his blind urge for superhuman power, Faust brought about the murder of Philemon and Baucis, unquote. Quote, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing else, but in its own existence, unquote. Ever since the Age of Enlightenment and in the era of scientific rationalism, the psyche had become synonymous with consciousness. There was no psyche outside the ego. Therefore, Jung continued, we must repudiate the arrogant claim of the conscious mind to be the whole of the psyche, and to admit that the psyche is a reality which we cannot grasp with our present means of understanding. The problem of modern man is, as Jung saw it, God almightiness, that is, the identification of the ego with the objective psyche or the divine. We may say as well that the sin of modern man is his inflation. As the Red Book strongly suggests, as long as we are unwilling to return to poverty for the sake of the God, and as long as we are unwilling to accept the burden of our spiritual poverty, then despite all our material wealth, there will remain a lack of inner happiness. Up to his old age, Jung was attracted to the simple life in the midst of nature. Only a few years after his descent to the depths in the Red Book in 1923, he started to build the tower at Bollingen. Whenever his schedule would allow, he lived a rather primitive life there with no electricity and no running water. He cooked all the meals on the open fire. There he felt at home, connected with the spirit of the depths. From the beginning, he said in his memoirs, I felt the tower as I felt the tower as in some way a place of maturation, a maternal womb or maternal figure in which I could become what I was, what I am, and will be. At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself here. Here I am, as it were, the age-old son of the mother. Indeed, the spirit of the depths forced him down to the last and simplest things. In the Tower of Bollingen, living a most simple life, Jung had materialized these last and simplest things. This was the place he felt nearest to the soul. Okay, there's a couple more sections to this, but I wanted to stop on that for a bit. And I'll take a look at your comments. Let's see. Okay, so Penelope says, God is within me. Chris says, yes. Penelope says, I had ongoing horrors, and now I am a whole role model to others who suffer. Life is a challenge for every soul. Yes, live it fully. The path, and Chris, the path is always going to be rough, and what is to be rough one, it's designed like that. Richard Casper says, that's a fair assessment, Chris. When you reach the true alchemy of your soul, you realize a little deeper, and you see the rawness of the earth. And then you truly see the functions of the stones. And Cherie says, we are the history of all mankind. And finishing Richard's sentence, and then you truly see the functions of the stones and structures. Chris, yes, Richard, the truth resides within. Those structures were amplifiers for the consciousness. That's the truth. Richard, alchemy to me ended up a choice of either suffering now and earning a spot in heaven, or heaven now with hell in the next life. I chose to suffer now. Kathy says, wow, Chris, in India, they have myths regarding flying crafts called Vimana that were piloted by awakened individuals. Richard, alchemy is black magic. Make no excuses for it. It's rough. Chris says it's rough, Richard. Richard says, yes, it is. Chris, let's see. I feel like my path is to help people see their own path again. Richard says, unless one meets God's expectations and approval, It's all a vain pursuit. Cherie, I had a psychic experience visiting the Cano Cristales River in central Colombia, the most beautiful river I have ever seen. It turns different shades of colors of aqua blues, greens. Richard, that's great, Chris. I'll add you to my prayers. Bless you, Richard. Richard, you too. Cherie, may I ask what you experience? Richard says poverty is when it's at, and I'm impressed with Dr. Jung today. Chris, Jesus was the king of the poor. Richard, yes, Jesus is the God man who bears the scars of human experience. Cherie, I became one with the river, a timelessness. I had experienced a devastating experience before being in the mountains outside of Bogota, Colombia, and Indian guides took me there. My life was spared. Very interesting. Okay, as you see, my voice is giving up on me. So this essay has a few more pages to it. I won't be able to get to the end of it today. So I guess what I will do is end it for today and see what I can do about discussing it with you folks. I think many of you have had experiences similar to me. Um, and I guess I would refer back to Philemon and Bacchus because that's such a good story, and basically what it indicates is that Philemon and Bacchus had recognized the God within, even though they were seeing it in their guests when magical things started to happen in their room. And what we must do, we who are those people who have experienced God, is convey our experiences. And obviously, I try to do that every week to the extent that I can. And I feel it every morning when I do my painting. That does remind me, I wanted to share with you again, because you may not recall the painting that I have been working on getting to the point where it could be made available to people. And so when I get that out here, all right, so this is the painting, and what it does for me, it expresses everything about what we're talking about in this painting. And you may not understand it. This painting took me only an hour and a half as compared to another of my paintings, which has taken the whole year, the entire year of 2024. But this painting is entitled Tracks to Nowhere Through Magnificence. And the point of it is that it captures the essence of what Dr. Jung is talking about. All the tracks that you see there are symbolic of every book that you've ever read, every statement that anybody has ever made to you, because whoever it is, including me, is trying to get you to see things their way. And the point is that you have to see things your way. And we live in unbelievable magnificence. The universe and our home, the earth, is magnificent in every respect, and we can't criticize it. And yes, in the tradition of our time, we can mansplain it. We can explain what everything is, but each one of those explanations is one of these tracks, and these tracks go nowhere because they remain on the earth, um, and they don't really see or encompass the magnificence. So in 1976, now 48 years ago, we launched Voyager, and Carl Sagan required that a gold record be attached to Voyager that would tell the story of humanity. And that's kind of the ultimate example of uh, egocentrism, because it's going nowhere. No probably living being will ever see that record, at least not since it was launched. And if it happens to be seen by a living being, uh, it could be billions of years hence, and what would they know? Um, and so it again, it's an example of a track to nowhere through magnificence, through the magnificence of the universe. And these satellites still communicate with us, or these probes, I guess we would call them, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, um, are still traveling out through the universe. They're on a track to nowhere because we have no idea wherever they might end up. And they simply ignore the magnificence of the whole universe. And I don't know if I've explained this very well, but the concept is, and Jung's point is, that all of everything that you ever hear from the scientific method or whatever it is simply a track to nowhere. It tells a story about one little corner of the universe, but it ignores the magnificence of what's going on around us in the universe. And so I just felt that this piece really captures the essence of that. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but that's my view. And so anyway, I'm currently having it photographed with a view to making prints of it available at fairly low cost. Um, and and those may be available um, for purchase before Christmas. And by low cost, I mean in the $20 to $30 range. I mean, Giclée prints are not cheap. They're a costly way to make a print, but it's not like offset printing when you can print and uh, make 1,000 copies for $1,000 or something like that. But it they are individual, and uh, they really express for me what it is that I've been doing all this time, which is to keep pointing at the magnificence and pointing out that the railroad tracks actually go nowhere. Okay. I mean, everything, when we had Voyager turn around and look back at the Earth, um, I'm going to put a picture of that up here so that you can see it. Um, so everything that has ever been happened in the history of the world has happened on that pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan pointed out. Now, this was Voyager as it was passing Jupiter, and an alert astronomer in the middle of the night, with no permissions or anything, uh, calculated that she could turn the Voyager camera back at Earth and catch this picture. And so there she did it. And so everything that any of us have ever learned, studied, experienced in the whole history of the world happened on that pale blue dot. And it amounts to almost nothing in the vastness of the universe, of course. Um, and so that's what I always think about, that, what we are and where we're going in the greater scheme of things is pretty limited. Uh, and so So anyway, Richard was again talking about Christianity. He says Jesus is the God man who bears the scars of human experience, human existence. Well, I guess all of us bear those scars. Sherry says, I became one with the river of timelessness, right? Um, and that was 1978. And then she says, or Sakura Tesson says, the childlike character of our soul, in our doodling, we can express it, absolutely. And it doesn't require a great artist. I have never claimed to be a great artist, or certainly not a person that can serve as a camera, which many artists do. Um, serve as cameras. They just put down on the paper what they see, but you can tell a real artist by um, by the fact that they aren't just making a duplicate. So if you think of the method of trompe l'oeil, um, that is a method called fooling the eye, and it makes the person think that something actually is there, and it's very fastidiously copying what's in what they see. But obviously, in my painting, I'm not putting anything that you see in the physical world, but it's a concept of how monumental everything that happens to us is. Um, and so Richard says, the closer one gets to truth, the more the devil messes with us. Shuri, that sounds like a beautiful experience, Shuri. Very divider. No, Chris says that. And Penelope loves the painting, and Penelope and I have talked about it. several times, so she's prepared to see what I'm talking about. Um, and Chris says, we follow in Jesus' name. What would Jesus do? And Penelope says, I agree not to concretize the ideas. Jesus, and Chris, Jesus is your third eye, people. And Richard says, Skip, try this. Take a pic of your painting on any cell phone and then keep enlarging it and look for faces and figures in it. Well, that's basically the essence of what I do in most of my painting. It's just, and yes, there are probably faces and figures in it. One Jungian analyst that I know reminds me that when you're painting, the first thing that appears is evil. And so here in this lower right, where you see this purple, it obviously looks very much like the face of evil there. And other versions of this suggest that as well. Because there are, let me see, I think, I think I have here, I've created another version. I've used the same thing, but I painted on photocopy paper. I decided to put further color and fill it in. And here, the face of a witch in profile. And so this version of it, I'm also making a copy of just for myself because the original is not worth keeping. It's after I painted on it, it's sort of disintegrating because it's very poor quality photocopy paper. But I'm printing it as a reminder, and I'm entitling this version of it "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead." So anyway, that has meaning to me, but it doesn't have to have any experience or meaning to you. Um, and and Chris says Jesus is the key to heaven. And, I would refer you all to Paul Simon's um, new album, Seven Psalms, his 2023 album, where his wife, Edie Brickell, sings that heaven is beautiful. It's almost like home. And I'm sure that that's true. Yeah. And Chris says, without darkness, there would be no light. Yeah, for sure. Um, and Richard says, I gave him an appreciation of modern art. Well, I'm glad because I didn't used to like modern art at all. Um, and I there was a time when I, like many Western men, would say, you know, any kindergartner could do this. And in fact, that's certainly true, but they wouldn't be able to tell you the meaning of it. And so, from a perspective of art and modern art, um, I think that we have to look beyond whether it's a picture of something. We have cameras for that today. And so just having a picture of something doesn't get you very far. And what you need to know is that the modern artists, the people that started it, and Picasso and others, uh, they put meaning into their paintings, and so it's no longer just a photograph or a copy of something that you can put in an album. They're actually conveying something that is beyond the physical world. And I always think of Picasso's painting as painting one of his 7 paramours. I'm not sure that any of them were actual wives, but he lived he was serially monogamous, I think, and he had 7 major relationships in his life, and each one of them he painted uh, he painted portraits of them, and one of them he was doing this portrait very seriously, and then when he turns it around, it's a picture of a flower that almost looks like a sunflower on a stalk with some leaves out to the side. And this is after having his paramour sit for him for hours. And it's just an amusing statement to the rest of us that you can't look for beauty um, in the physical world. You have to look for it in the way somebody thinks, and that's the difference between a Picasso and anybody else that's painting. So anyway, thank you all for being here today, and I will think I've gotten to the end of the list here. So, um, Chris, you say that Jesus is the key to heaven, and I'm sure that's true for lots of people, billions of them, who have followed the Christian path. And every path has its beauty um, and its effectiveness. Otherwise, they would no longer exist, right? We don't eat things that we don't like. We don't um, purchase images of things if we don't like them or if we don't connect with them in some way. And so Jesus is certainly a part of the path, even my path for that matter, because I was brought up as a Christian. Um, and, I don't think it's necessary. As Chris says, I don't practice any religion. Um, I study them. Well, that's probably a good path to take because by studying them, one understands what humanity is doing to itself. And that's a good thing. And Richard says he likes classical art, especially Tintoretto. Okay, good. I like lots of classical art too. Um, in a lot of it, you can see the soul of the painter in the image that's depicted. And whether it's a sculpture or a painting or what have you. And so that's powerful. Uh, I'm reminded of a joking image, which someone had taken a picture from behind a group of 4 nuns who are pointing out. One of them is pointing up at the statue of David, and um, it has a caption on it which says, "I don't know much about art, but I know what I like." It's just a silly thing, but okay. So Mrs. Pablo Picasso said, if my husband ever met a woman on the street who looked like the woman in his paintings, he would faint. Well, I'm sure that's true. Um, and so anyway, peace, everyone. I'm going to bail out at this point. We'll see you next week. Hopefully. I have surgery on Wednesday, so depending on how I'm feeling, we'll see if we have a class next week.